Mark chapter 1, verses 42 through 45, as Pastor Mike mentioned just a little bit ago. Mark 1, 40 through 45. And it says this. And a leper came to him, imploring him, and kneeling, said to him, "If you will, you can make me clean." Moved with pity, he stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I will, be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean. And Jesus sternly charged him and sent him away at once and said to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded for proof to them." But he went out and began to talk freely about it and to spread the news, so that Jesus could no longer openly enter town, but was out in desolate places, and people were coming to him from every quarter. Would you pray with me? Father, I thank you for your goodness. Thank you for your word, and I ask this morning that you would please help me to put your word on display before your people in such a way that we cannot help but worship you and honor your Son. That, Father, our response would be gratitude and thankfulness in every circumstance, because what we realize and recognize was accomplished on our behalf. Please help me to make sense and encourage your people. And please be glorified in all that I say this morning, Lord. Amen. So, for those of you who were here when Pastor Mike read a rather lengthy chunk of the book of Leviticus a little bit ago, that was a lengthy chunk of the book of Leviticus. And it can be easy sometimes when we're reading some of those Old Testament texts that don't relate to us really quickly and really easily. It can be easily to get lost and distracted and feel like it's minutia. But the reality is this. The Bible is full of these pictures that are shadows and images of something more significant to come. And that section that Pastor Mike read today is like that. There are many things that we do, and I love this about many different storytellers. I love to read stories, I love to watch stories, I like stories in general. And I'm sure many of you have seen this or read this in a variety of things where people will put out hints. And if you read carefully enough, and if you watch carefully enough this story, you can get a pretty good idea of what's going to happen next, or what's going to happen at the end of a movie or a book or what have you. It's foreshadowing. For example, if you were to watch the Superman movie, one of the more recent ones, you can see that Superman, when he's a kid, he's always wearing red and blue. And for somebody who knows that Superman ultimately ends up in red and blue, you can see and you notice as a kid, well, clearly that kid's going to be Superman one day, and they're making it really obvious at the beginning of the movie. The same thing for Batman, if you like comics and things like that. As a kid, he goes down into the cave, and all of a sudden there's bats all around him, and it's this picture of something that's going to come in the future, right? And for those who have seen Superman or Batman, when you go back, it becomes glaringly obvious that this is a hint. This is a picture of what's going to happen. That's kind of what this story is here today. This story about the leper is actually a picture. It's a hint. It's a foreshadowing of a much greater story that's about to come. And Mark lays it all out so that, especially for those original readers, because if you remember, as we've talked about this over the last weeks, this book was really meant to be somebody would get up in front of a congregation and they would read the entirety of the book of Mark, all in one sitting. And so the listeners would go through and they'd hear the whole thing at one time. And they would be aware, right? This is after the resurrection of Jesus that this book was written. So they would be aware of what happened with Jesus. So as they sat down and as they listened to this, and they recognized, because they were in this Jewish community in the New Testament, they would have recognized probably a lot of things that we don't automatically pick up on. And they would have seen the foreshadowing and the hints and the pictures maybe in a way a little bit more clearly than we do sometimes. And that's what today, again, is like. In these just 5 verses, Mark builds a narrative that hints at what is to come. As this is happening, as he heals this leper, we read this section, Jesus is still around the area of the Sea of Galilee, where he does much of his ministry in the northern part of Israel. He's already called 4 disciples to be with him and to follow him. He's gone to the synagogue where he displayed his authority to be able to preach and proclaim the word, not based on other teachers and not based on other men, but based on his own authority. And simultaneously, he goes to a demon and he casts out this unclean spirit from a man, again, not invoking any other authority than his own. He continues in the next couple of verses into last week to heal and to banish demons. But then Mark takes some time and he spends a little bit of time on this specific healing, if we want to call it that. And he gives this one more time than many of the others. And he does it for a reason, to draw an illustration, to give us a hint and to make a picture. So we'll start going through this. Mark 1, verse 40. And a leper came to him, imploring him, and kneeling, said to him, "If you will, you can make me clean." Now again, for many of us, this can look like a rather simple statement. There was a guy with leprosy, and he came to Jesus and he said, "Please cleanse me." But there's actually much more going on here. Many things that we would actually lose today. So I'm going to go back. We're going to take a little bit of a step back here and explain some of the background of some of these things so that we get the same picture that the early church would have understood. Now, first of all, just as a little reference, he's talking about leprosy here. There was a man who was leprous. Now, modern day, we have this thing called leprosy, which is also known as Hansen disease. That's not what the New Testament is talking about, and that's not what the Old Testament is talking about. When they refer to leprosy, it's a different disease than what we refer to today as leprosy. For them, it was a kind of catch-all term for many different kinds of diseases, right? This was not a really carefully thought-out medical description for them. It was just a catch-all phrase for all kinds of different things that people would have. And it was really, when somebody had leprosy, it was about a lot more than just being sick. If we picture this gentleman as just a sick guy who's coming to ask to be healed, we're missing the boat on the significance of this. Jesus has definitely healed sick people, right? He healed Simon Peter's mother-in-law just a few verses back, and that was no big deal for him. But when it talks about healing her, it doesn't say that he cleansed her. It says that he healed her. It's kind of a different thing. What happens with this man, he doesn't ask, "Jesus, can you heal me?" That's not what he says. He says, "Jesus, can you cleanse me?" It's different. It is a disease, and he is sick. But he doesn't have to be healed. He has to be cleansed. Because there's a huge amount that goes into this concept of what it is to have leprosy in the Old Testament and in the New. And this concept of being clean and unclean is a huge one through the book of Mark. And we're going to see this come up over and over and over again. Specifically, not, like I said, just a few verses back, when Jesus approaches an evil spirit, a demon, Mark describes this demon or this evil spirit not as a demon or an evil spirit, but an unclean spirit. And he makes this man clean. And we're going to see this happen over and over and over again, where Mark is going to refer to things as unclean and clean and unclean and clean. And it kind of sets the stage for what Jesus is going to do. Another way to talk about things being unclean and clean, we could use the terminology of pure, or holy, or righteous, or perfect, or some of those kinds of things. Right? For somebody who is clean, or somebody who's pure, they're allowed to approach the temple and they can worship at the temple. They can be involved in the community of God. They can do all of these things. They can participate with God himself in what he's doing. But somebody who is unclean or impure is separated from God's people. Somebody who's unclean or impure can't go to the temple and do the worship that they were called to do. In many senses, this idea of being unclean is associated with the idea of sin and rejection and ostracization from both God and from God's people. And leprosy was actually this stand-in image of this impurity, of imperfection. And we see this over and over again. And this concept of leprosy is probably one of the most clear pictures. It's the most dramatic living analogy of sin that there might even be in the Old Testament. It's this really distinct picture of both sin and its destruction and its consequences. And it's a leprous man who comes and speaks with Jesus. In Leviticus 13 and 14, we see many of the laws. Again, Pastor Mike read a big old section. Thank you so much, Pastor Mike. All about this. But I'm going to read just a couple of snippets out of it, just so we can get context for how big of a deal it was to be a person with leprosy and what the consequences were. In Leviticus 13, 45 through 46, it says this: "The leprous person who has the disease shall wear torn clothes, and let the head of his hair hang loose. And he shall cover his upper lip and cry out, 'Unclean, unclean!' And he shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp." Numbers, just a little bit later, we see this happen inside of Israel. Numbers chapter 5, verses 1 through 4. "The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, 'Command the people of Israel that they put out of the camp everyone who's leprous or has a discharge, and everyone who is unclean through contact with the dead. You shall put out both male and female, putting them outside the camp, and that they may not defile their camp, in the midst of which I dwell.' And the people of Israel did so, and they put them outside of the camp. And the Lord said to Moses, so the people of Israel did." And again, in Leviticus 14, 1 through 20, Pastor Mike talked about so much of those. I'm not going to read through that whole section again, but it was this constant discussion of the sacrifices that were required. And for those of you who maybe were listening, and I won't read through the whole thing again, but I encourage you to do so, you'll notice that the sacrifices required in the Old Testament, when you became pure or clean again after leprosy, was strikingly similar to those that one had to perform if one had sinned before the Lord our God. Strikingly similar. The consequences of having leprosy were difficult. They required a blood sacrifice to be reunited into the community of God. A person became impure, unclean, and banished from society if they had leprosy. This isn't just somebody with a busted leg or somebody with the flu. This would be something like, and we can all relate to this, God kind of unfortunately gave us a real good comparison. Could you imagine if we were still in the pandemic, somebody had COVID, but they had it all the time, no ceasing, you're not going to get over it, no vaccine, no hydroxychloroquine, whatever you use, none of it's going to work. You are forever going to have COVID and forever infectious. You are never allowed to go to work again. You can't be around any of your family. You can't be around anybody, and everybody's going to treat you like an outcast. Don't come around me, I don't want what you have. Right? We got a little taste of that. But this is forever. That's what leprosy was. It's this idea where as soon as you get it, and it was visible, you could see it on their skin, you could see what was happening, and they literally had to cry out, "Unclean, unclean." So you can't approach anybody, and everybody had a warning that you're one of those unclean people. You're ostracized from all of society. This was a very difficult, tragic thing to have. Now, we understand through the New Testament and through the Old Testament that it's not necessarily true that everybody who's sick is sick because they sinned. We see that in other places in the gospel where Jesus makes that clear. Not everybody is sick. Sometimes God allows that to happen for his own glory and many different purposes. However, during this time, one of the things that is true is that people would often associate, not only was this an ostracization, not only were you sick, not only did they want you around because they didn't want to be infected, but many people would very distinctly associate the concept of leprosy with the concept of sin. If you were leprous, during the New Testament times and often in the Old Testament times, people would oftentimes jump to the conclusion you probably deserved it because you're a sinner. You failed. And they would pick this up from places like Numbers 12, 9 through 15. I won't read some of these sections, but that's the story where Miriam rebels against Moses. Moses is in charge, and Miriam, his sister, says, "But what about me? I'm clever. I should probably be in charge." And God's response to Miriam was this. He gave her leprosy. As a response to her sinfulness, the consequence of that was leprosy. We see that again in 2 Chronicles 26, 16 through 23. King Uzziah becomes arrogant and prideful and starts talking about how great he is and all of these kinds of things. And the consequence of this again is leprosy. So even throughout the Old Testament, not to say that everybody in the Old Testament who always had leprosy was a sinner, but there was this connection that leprosy did have a tendency to be a punishment type of thing that God would use to discipline those who were arrogant. And so it's not really a surprise to make that leap in the New Testament where if somebody has leprosy, it's not a huge surprise that people might make that jump. Well, maybe you were disobedient to Yahweh. Maybe you're arrogant. Maybe you're all those things. So not only are you physically unclean, but it would also be easily linked to the concept of somebody being spiritually unclean. It's a devastating thing to have. You're rejected on almost every level from society. So, to sum this up, right, just to get a picture of what's happening when this man approaches Jesus. He's a banished man, isolated from society, possibly for the rest of his life. He's not allowed to be associated with anybody, his friends or family. He can't work like a normal man. Nobody can talk to him. He has to declare his uncleanness everywhere he goes. He actually had no business approaching Jesus. He shouldn't have done that. He wasn't supposed to do that. But he does. Because this man is looking, and he asks not just to be healed, but he asks that Jesus would make him clean. Which is a much bigger deal even than just being healed. He wants to be clean. He wants to be purified. He wants to be holy again. That's the setup for this. And I got to point out one more thing too. As Jesus has begun to make his mark in the area of Galilee, the way that this man actually approaches Jesus is significant too. Because again, oftentimes people might ask for people to pray. We do this all the time now. Hey, could you pray for me? I've got a cold. Could you pray for me? I've got surgery coming up. Could you pray for me? All of these kinds of things. And our response would be, sure, I'd be delighted to pray for you. And what do? We appeal to God. Right? That was not dissimilar at this time. Right? People did not in and of themselves simply have the ability to decide who was healed and who wasn't healed. But it's remarkable because this man, as he approaches Jesus, evidently his fame, some of what he was doing is spread enough that when he talks to Jesus, he doesn't say, Jesus, can you pray for me that I would be healed? That's not what he does. He doesn't say, Jesus, can you appeal? Jesus, can you give me some whatever, medical advice? Jesus, can you do this? He simply says this. Jesus says, if you will, make me clean. He knows that he can. He knows that he's perfectly capable of doing this. If you will, you can make me clean. This is a really significant admission of the authority of Christ, of Jesus. He's appealing to him on his own authority. If you want this to happen, Jesus, if you want me to be clean, I will be clean. Please make me clean. That's a significant confession. Again, we would never do that. Nobody would come to me and say, Ted, Pastor Ted, if you're super whatever, respectful about it, if you will, I will be clean. Nobody would ever approach me like that, nor should you. We would never even approach a doctor like that, right? Even the most advanced medical personnel in known history, we would never go to them and say, if it be your desire, I can be fixed. We don't even do that. We might say, hey, can you help me? Maybe, nothing's absolutely for certain. It's not simply by their will that we are healed. And yet this is how this man approaches Jesus. If you will, you can make me clean. That's a significant admission of the authority of this man, Jesus. And it ties in, right? When Jesus was in the synagogue and he was teaching, not like one of the scribes, but under his own authority. He didn't appeal to other sources. He didn't appeal to other men who had great ideas. He said, this is what I say it is, and that's therefore what it is. When he drove out the unclean spirit, he didn't appeal to greater men in history. He didn't do any kind of divine incantations. He didn't do any of that. He simply said, leave. And he left. All on his own authority. And that's catching on, and that's how this man approaches Jesus. By your authority, if you desire this to be, it will be. And Jesus responds, verses 41 to 42. Moved with pity, he stretched out his hand and he touched him, and he said to him, I will, be clean. And immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean. We're not told a lot about the man who has leprosy. We don't know all of his history. We don't know why he had leprosy. We don't know much about what he did or why he did it. But it can be said that he was right about this part of Jesus. He was right. Jesus did have the ability that if he so desired, that he could show up and he would be clean. He was right. And Jesus does something rather interesting again. See, again, going back to all of the Old Testament significance of this idea of having leprosy, you weren't supposed to touch something like that. There was this whole list of things that you couldn't do. You couldn't touch them, you couldn't be around them, you couldn't do this, because if you touched this thing, you would become unclean. Unclean things made other things unclean too. Numbers 19:22, again going back to the law of the Torah, says this, and whatever the unclean person touches shall be unclean, and anyone who touches it shall be unclean till evening. Being unclean was a big deal here. You don't want to be unclean. Again, it causes separation from worship, and it causes separation from society. And so Jesus, right, the natural response to going up to somebody or something that was unclean is you don't touch it. You stay away from it because you're going to be unclean too. But that is not what we see Jesus do. Jesus doesn't go up to this man. This man appeals for help, and Jesus said, whoa, hold on now. You're unclean, and I can't interact with you. You don't see anything like that. Instead, here's Jesus' response. He touches him, and he says, I will. Be clean. Just like when he's proclaiming the scriptures in the synagogue, just like when he's interacting with this demon, Jesus is different than everyone else. See, when the man found this unclean spirit, we're not given the history of that man a couple of verses back, but the unclean spirit, when he was indwelling in the man, made the man unclean. That's normally how things work. Normally, when we come in contact with unclean things, that unclean thing wins and we become unclean. But Jesus doesn't work that way. When Jesus interacted with an unclean spirit, the man who was indwelling became clean again. When Jesus touches an unclean man, unlike every other human being, instead of Jesus becoming unclean, the man becomes clean. Jesus is more powerful than even the uncleanness of leprosy. He has authority even over this. Jesus wills it, and this man isn't just healed. Right? This isn't just a healing, but the man becomes acceptable to society, becomes acceptable to God again, if he so will. In the sense of being able to enter into worship at the temple. Not that he was rejected by God. We don't know where he was at with God exactly. But as Jesus interacts with him, he breaks, if you will, sort of the rules. But in one sense, it's not really breaking the rules because he's actually the one who made the rules and he's the one who put all of the rules together and he's the one in charge of the rules. And the reality is he interacts with the world in a way unique because he is the Son of God, the Messiah, the Christ, the one prophesied about. And it doesn't work the same with him as it does with any other man. Because he's unlike every other man. And so the man becomes clean. And Jesus, in 43 through 45, and Jesus sternly charged him and said to him, away at once, and sent him away at once, and said to him, see that you say nothing to anyone, but go. Show yourself to the priest and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded for a proof to them. But he went out and began to freely talk about it and to spread the news so that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, but was out in desolate places, and people were coming to him from every quarter. Now Jesus commands this man, after not just healing him, but making him again clean. Jesus commands him, he says, don't go talking about this stuff. Here's what I want you to do. Go back to the priest. And we read these sections. Pastor Mike, again, did a great job. And verse 14, we read these sections, and it talks about if for whatever reason you actually are healed of leprosy, here's the tradition, the ritual, the command by God of what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to go back. You're supposed to make sacrifices. You're supposed to show yourself to the priests, and they will declare that you were healed and that you can again re-enter society. You can again go to the temple and to worship God. You can engage with all of these things that you can't engage with before. Jesus sends him back to do that. Now, it doesn't exactly tell us. There's not a lot of information in this section. We don't know if he went back to do that or not. It doesn't exactly say. It doesn't say he didn't. It doesn't say he did. But what we do know is that for whatever reason, instead of keeping this a secret like Jesus asked him to, he starts to go out and he talks to everybody. Now again, we've had fun. We had fun in our community groups. I know Pastor Mike had fun in his community group. We can talk about why that might have been, and there's a lot of different possible solutions about why he decided to disobey Jesus and all of these things. And the reality is it doesn't tell us, and we don't know. We can maybe have some good guesses, but we don't know. But that's not really the most significant aspect of this text anyway. The real point is, what is the consequence of what happened when this man goes out and begins to proclaim all that Jesus did? That's actually what Mark is trying to draw our eyes to. What's the consequence of what happens here? And what happens is that Jesus can no longer enter the towns. And Jesus is forced to stay outside of the camp in these desolate places because it's too chaotic. So when Jesus cleanses the leper, and we have to import all that information, remember what it was that the leper was really suffering. It wasn't just that he was sick, but he was ostracized. He was kept outside the camp. He was not allowed to be involved in society. He had to be away from everyone and be outside. Jesus allowed him to go inside the camp. But as a consequence of Jesus allowing this man to come back into the camp through being clean, The consequence of that is now Jesus has to be outside the camp. Not because he's unclean, but he in many ways trades places with this leper. There's a fun term for this, I promise. I'm not going to be handing out fill-in-blank tests on this topic. I'm not going to be requesting that you guys be able to put this back, but there's a fun word for this in theological terms. We call it substitutionary atonement. And for an extra 10 points afterwards, if you want to, remember that next week, I'll give you an extra 10 points and a gold star. But there's this idea in Scripture, and this idea in theology called substitutionary atonement. And it was around for a very, very long time. And I'll give you a brief understanding and explanation of kind of what this is. Again, we're going to go back to Leviticus. Leviticus 16:21. And Aaron shall lay both his hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all the iniquities of the people of Israel, and all their transgressions, all their sins. And he shall put them on the head of the goat and send it away into the wilderness. Are you catching any linkages here? The hint is you shouldn't. By the hand of the man who's in readiness. So here's the point, right? One of the things that would happen in Israel is they would yearly take a goat, take all of the sin, the uncleanness, the impurities. They would put it on the goat and then send the goat out of the camp. Right? That goat became the impurity of the people and it was banished. That's the idea of substitutionary atonement. All the sins of the people placed on something else that would make payment for their own sin and sent out. But obviously a goat couldn't accomplish this. In Isaiah, just a few hundred years later, many hundred years later, picks this concept up and actually fleshes it out even more when he's talking about the Messiah, the servant who's going to come. He writes this in Isaiah 53:11-12. Out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors. So here this idea, this picture of something being able to take the impurity and the uncleanness off of something else, take it onto themselves, right? At first it was a goat. And now Isaiah begins to develop this concept, and he applies it to the servant who's going to come. Now the iniquities and the sin and the impurities, this servant who's going to come was perfect and pleasing and had no impurities, and yet he's going to take the impurity of everyone on himself. And he's going to become counted with the transgressors. Not that he ever transgressed, but he would take their impurities. So Isaiah develops this idea of substitutionary atonement and applies it to a man, to a servant that was going to come. This story is an Easter egg. It's a picture, it's a hint. It's the bats flying around Bruce Wayne when he's a little kid. Right? I'm assuming everybody's getting this picture by now. Jesus has stepped in and is going to be cast outside of the city. He can't be in the city, and he did that because he allowed somebody else to go into the city. He's taking on this man's punishment, if you will. He's making this man clean. And what's amazing, too, is even through this man's disobedience, right? He didn't do what Jesus asked him to do. But you don't see Jesus going back and saying, well, fine, if you're going to be a punk about it then, leprosy for you. He doesn't do that. He stays outside of the city, and he continues to work and to do. And this man, as far as we're aware, continues to be not just healed, but made clean. And he remains clean. And just in case you haven't picked up the hint yet, I'm sure everybody has, I'm going to make it explicitly clear. This is a picture of the gospel. This is a picture of Jesus Christ. And it's not going to be long here in however many months when we get towards the end of this book. We're going to see him do this in a far more literal way. We're going to see Jesus on a cross taking all of the sins of man, being cast literally outside of the camp of Jerusalem in a very unclean, impure way. And he's going to be destroyed, and his body's going to be torn apart because he was going to be taking all of the iniquities and the uncleanness and the depravity of man, and he was going to pay for it on the cross. That's the teaser that this story is. That's the Easter egg that we're seeing here. It's the gospel. It's being made clean by the work of Jesus Christ. And Jesus taking that payment on himself. Paul later will write about this. After the church has gone out a little bit, he writes this and makes it very clear and very explicit. 2 Corinthians 5:21. For our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that we might become the righteousness of God. Not because we earned it, not because this leper had something in and of himself that made him worthy of Jesus saying, I will be clean. There's no story in the background of this leper talking about how he was a really good guy and he worshipped really well and he was a decent fellow and he had a family and he had all these things. And so God decided, well, I guess I'll do it because of these things about you. It had nothing to do with that. It simply was because God, Jesus, was willing. And so he did. This is a picture of the good news, the gospel of the kingdom of God that Jesus had come to proclaim. He was constantly showing us image after image after image after image. And as this book was being read to the church, you could almost stand up front and say, do you get it yet? Do you get it yet? Here's another picture. Do you get it now? Here's another picture. Do you get it now? Let me give you 10 more pictures of who this man is, what he's able to do, the authority that he has in and of himself to command spiritual realms, to command teaching, and to even command the cleanness and uncleanness talked about in the Levitical law. This man has authority over all of it. This man is able to do these things that no other man can do. Do you see it yet? Do you get who he is? Do you get our desperate need for him? Because here's the reality. Here's the reality, and this is going to become evident. Another thing that Paul writes is Romans 3:23. Many of us probably have heard this verse many times. For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. There's a really important word here, and it's all. Everyone. One of the tricks that they use in the New Testament, we don't always do this in modern writing, but in the New Testament, sometimes in the Old Testament, they would have people be stand-ins so that you would associate yourself with that person. And they would do that by not naming that person. This leper has no name. This person, he's not named. And part of the reason for that, and many people who were reading it at the time would have understood this, is when this person isn't named, there's kind of an idea that you're supposed to be able to put yourself in their place. That might be the person that you're supposed to imagine yourself to be, right? We all like to be the hero of the story. When we're reading stories and watching movies, we're all either, the hero. We're all the good guy. But this story is actually leading us, by not naming this leper and talking about this interaction, we're actually supposed to associate ourselves not with Jesus and not with his disciples, but with the leper. That's what we're supposed to relate to. And that's what Paul is explicit about each one of us in Romans 3:23. We have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Here's another way of talking about sinning. It means that we're unclean and should be thrown out of the camp and separated from both God and from God's people. That's what it means to be unclean. That's what it means to be a sinner. But he doesn't stop there, and he also Paul writes about this concept. Romans 5:8. But God shows his love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Much of what Paul is writing about in this book of Mark, he's asking these questions. Who is Jesus? How should we respond to him? And as we look at this text, we have to answer Jesus is the one who can, by his own divine authority and will, make unclean things clean again. That's Jesus. That's the one that we read about. And I think if we're all honest here, right, I probably would not have to go. I think if we all sat down, if I could sit down with every single person in this room, it wouldn't take us that long to say, how have you messed up in the last 24 hours? I'm not saying we're going to do this. I promise I'm not going to do this anymore. Because then I'd have to do it, and I'd be super embarrassed if I had to do it. But here's the reality. It would not take any of us very long at all to determine, let me list to you the ways that I am not a clean person. And we could go through our history and we could talk about the many, 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 many things that we are broken-hearted over. The ways that we have failed, the way that we've betrayed our God, the way we've betrayed God's people, the way we've betrayed our neighbors, all kinds of things. We can all go through and do this. And if we're honest with ourselves, and if we face reality, we recognize we are still a broken, unclean people. But what Mark is proclaiming about this man, Jesus, is that if we are the kind of people who go to him, and if we say, I am unclean, please make me clean. I want to be clean again. Jesus has the ability to do this. And he accomplished it ultimately by going on a cross and taking all of our sin and paying for it. All of the righteous, correct anger that God has against evil. And we all have evil in us. And we can't pretend that we don't. If so, we'll have a conversation. I'm pretty sure I can prove it really quick. We can't pretend that we don't. But Jesus went on the cross, and despite our own evil, he said, I will pay for that so that you can come back into the camp. That's the gospel of the kingdom. He came proclaiming that the kingdom is here. He purchased us entrance back into a relationship with God the Father. And all of this story with the leper, it's not just the story of a man who's just healed. It's not just another healing story. All of them are beautiful. This is a picture of a man who is ostracized, outside of God's people, cast away, being brought back, being made clean, and welcomed back into worship of God and back into relationship. And Jesus willingly, though Jesus never becomes unclean, but Jesus taking his place, just like he does on the cross. This is the God that we worship. This is the Jesus that we are called to follow. The Son of God who came and traded places with you and with me, who took my uncleanness and yours and paid for it, died for it, so that we could be reunited. And one of the things, as we close this out, that he calls us to do, we have communion set up here. When he does, he ultimately goes to the cross, and he gave us a tool to constantly remember what it is that Jesus did. To remember this concept of substitutionary atonement. Right? The idea of atonement being paying for something, making something right. And he was our substitute. Instead of us doing it, he substituted Jesus for this. And he went to the cross, and he died in our place. And the day before he did that, he sat with the disciples, and it was another huge symbol, which was the Exodus going from Israel, which we won't talk about just right now, but he was laying out this big picture of the Exodus, and they were sitting down and they were having a meal together, Passover, where once again God displayed salvation through blood, again through Passover. And Jesus said, now let me show you what ultimately that was pointing to. And it was, again, Jesus, saying it was actually his blood that was going to cause judgment to be passed over. And it was his body that was going to be substituted for ours on the cross. So what we'd like to do is we'd like to actually participate in remembering that today. So here's how we're going to do that. You don't have to be a member of our church. We just ask that you're somebody who's made the decision to follow Jesus Christ. So if you have committed your life to Jesus, we invite you to come up to the front to grab a piece of bread and to grab a cup, and then go ahead and go sit back down, and then I'll walk us through the rest of our communion this morning.